Hello, everyone. Hi. So many familiar faces. This is the second year that we're doing this. We did this in 2024, where we talked about the National Theatre and we talked about the people cultures in the National Theatre. And now it is 2 years later, and we decided to turn the lens to Singapore. This sense of turning the gaze to different sectors of arts and culture, is quite important because we don't come from a culture in Singapore where we ask ourselves what we want. We are very used to being led. It's kind of a growing sense of where do we find new spaces where people can start to ask some of these questions, can start to just kind of put out some ideas. I know there are people in the audience tonight who's very interested in some of these ideas, and perhaps these ideas don't just go into the air, but it goes somewhere where it lands like a spore. That is Singapore, right? There's a space in Berlin called Spore, and initially I thought, my God, what's this Singapore space? How come I didn't know about this? And then, of course, they are really referring to spores. So it's spore, but it doesn't mean Singapore. But we are also spore. So I feel that something like we're just trying to activate a kind of a space of spores which are floating, and perhaps it lands somewhere and it can find a place where it can be then germinated to something. So why we decided to do this, that's what I just said, right? That we feel like there's a kind of a growing sense in Singapore wanting to be more involved. I think that there's a lot of family foundations who are beginning also to look at the arts, looking at culture, to understand like how they can make a difference, right? Because we also saw, for example, last year, that there were international art collectors coming to Singapore. Kim Association, Tanoto. They come and they provide this kind of other space. Some people talk about this as a kind of a third space, some other space which is outside from Singaporeans and also the Singapore government, right? Or the National Arts Council, and how they've siloed the arts off more or less to the National Arts Council. They don't seem to have an entertainment council. And of course, that's some of the questions that we're asking tonight about what is the government infrastructure that could be needed? Because, in starting this work with Dick Lee and Jacinta, recently, since November, we have been working on the documentary of their lives. And you realize that, in the 70s, teenagers had very few options. And now there are many more options, but they're all internet global options. And the whole sense of, is it just about the Singapore song, about the way in which the Singapore government presently supports pop culture? Is more or less through this idea of the Singapore song and national identity, community bonding. And perhaps this is also a kind of a limit, and perhaps there needs to be more. So an example is Korea, right? When K-pop started, K-film, K-TV, Korean government started to have a KOCA, which is I can't remember the acronym, but what it means, but it's basically a Korean creative agency. And the brief to the Korean creative agency was to lift censorship and was to actually think of how they can support the infrastructure or build this soft power. And I find that as a kind of precedent that's very sophisticated, enlightened, and possibly also a precedent that can be useful for us today. Because it's a model that's beyond Nusantara, it's a model that's beyond Mandopop, because these models are market-oriented models. But this is one agency which received about 5 billion USD in 2024, perhaps, and the cultural export tripled. What they gained in terms of K-pop and KTV, and less about K-film, because those things are more beyond, but how KTV, for example, all this is gaining for the government of Korea, like about 12 billion. This was last year's figures. And so if we look at money, that's one thing, but what about the cultural phenomenon, right? That can we become a cultural phenomenon in Singapore first, with Singapore, beyond just the money situation? What is a phenomenon, right? And of course, I think tonight you'll hear many different voices. We we went out in search of artists who would talk and would want to express themselves, because we found this quite different from the art scene, because in the pop scene, a lot of people are represented by managers. So then it's a kind of a cutoff, right? That means you're not directly actually in a position where we can speak directly with the artists themselves or the artists themselves about what they want to say and where they want to go with their own careers and how they become empowered. So I feel like this was a first step of discovery for us. But we found very great individuals who wanted to join us and who felt like they have something important to add. And it's interesting, all the different positions, the search for authenticity, the search for different maybe niche spaces where they can navigate something more. And I feel like at the back of a lot of what you'll hear today is something which is related a little bit to the ghost of some specter behind, which is how much national infrastructure should we have, right? And not ending up as just a national product, but like with K-pop or K whatever, the Korean wave, it was about this export, not so much about community bonding, right? So there is this specter of like, do we want any support? Like in the arts, I always say, please get out. And then you don't censor at all. You don't provide any money, you don't censor. So is that also a choice? There is a way in which the control, but you see, the Korean instance was so interesting because they deliberately set up a KOCA, KOCA, which was to actually look at censorship and look at something about how do we export without censoring, right? And you see, like KTV, for example, is definitely not what primetime Media Corp is producing, right? They're going much beyond because they dare to take the boundary more. And I have best friends in Netherlands who are watching KTV all the time. I mean, and they are not even Asian. So, so I think that this is something to think about. How do we move into a global space? Maybe market, maybe not market, but some kind of phenomenon which comes from this part of the world, right? And this part of the world, of course, there is Indonesia, there is Thailand, very big players, there is Philippines, but, Singapore is quite, or where we come from is very, I think, it's very dynamic. It's a crossing of so many intersections. And so I think that we can go much, much further than where we are today. Today, there will also be a talk about industry, corporatization, branding, and in the end, a sense of how do you stay connected to yourself and yet this specter of possibly national infrastructure, because we are ready now for a new turn, right? I mean, we've got enough of the Singapore song and the national identity, and what's the next turn? Because it's also about the arts aligning itself in certain directions. Arts, entertainment, I mean it in a very broad way, culture, because we need to align and to lobby or advocate for something before the decision is made. We know how decisions are made, and then you can never turn back. It just goes in a certain direction. So it's a kind of a moment where there's a kind of a cusp. I feel like we are reaching the end of a time, because we are in a way in some kind of forever war. It's a third world war that's going on, and there is a kind of a turn now. Something's happening, and maybe we in Singapore are perhaps also something is happening where we can actually take this turn as the world turns, right? So I would like to start with just that, and I'll come back much later, and we'll probably go into the speakers now and all the different positions. And please give a warm round of applause to all the speakers, to yourselves for coming here as well. Thank you very much.